I grew up as the middle child of five, with younger twins Aaron and Lily, who had special needs. But even being in the middle didn't come with the perks most people imagine. I wasn't doted on or spoiled. Instead, I became what they call a glass child, present but invisible, seen only through the distortions of my siblings' problems. My parents were always consumed by the chaos of someone else's drama. Whether it was Alex's failing grades, Jessica's toxic relationships, or Mark's wild attempts to find himself, their crises left no room for me. As a child, I quickly learned self-reliance. If I wanted to eat, I cooked. If I wanted to talk, I journaled. If I wanted love, well, I learned to live without it. That's not to say I didn't try to stand out. I would bring home straight A's, lead school projects, and once even won a local art competition, but the applause always seemed to die before it reached my parents' ears. They were too busy sorting out another shouting match or driving someone to therapy.
It wasn't all bad, though.
Amid the neglect, I found Sophie and Rachel. They were my salvation, my lifeline. We bonded over our shared invisibility in our own families. Sophie's parents were more interested in their social circle than their daughter, and Rachel was practically raised by her grandmother while her mom cycled through a revolving door of relationships. We called ourselves the Forgotten Three, a bittersweet label we wore like armor. Together, we made up for what our families lacked. We celebrated each other's birthdays, cheered at soccer games, and sat through terrible breakups with bowls of ice cream and cheap wine. By the time we hit our early 20s, it was clear that our little trio was stronger than blood. Moving out together felt inevitable. We pooled our meager savings and rented a cramped but cozy apartment on the edge of the city. It wasn't much: creaky floors, a leaky faucet, and walls thin enough to hear the neighbors' late-night karaoke sessions, but it was ours. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Leaving home was less dramatic than I'd imagined. I packed my things methodically, fitting my life into 2 suitcases and a couple of cardboard boxes. My mom didn't even glance up from her tablet, and my dad was preoccupied fixing a clogged sink. I had half expected someone to stop me, to say something, anything. Instead, they let me slip out the door like a ghost. That night, sitting on a mattress in my new apartment, I had a realization. They didn't notice because they didn't care. The truth was as freeing as it was devastating. Life with Sophie and Rachel became my new normal. We split bills, made midnight snack runs, and binge-watched terrible TV shows. They were my chosen family, and I thought nothing could shake us. But life has a way of creeping in when you least expect it, twisting the things you hold dear. It started with a phone call on a gray Tuesday morning, one I'll never forget. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I saw my dad's name flashing on the screen. We hadn't spoken in months, so the sight of it sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I let it ring longer than I should have, staring at the screen as if the name itself could explain the sudden contact. Finally, I answered, bracing for what I assumed would be a request for a favor or some update I didn't ask for. Instead, his voice came through sharp and cold, as if he were talking to a stranger. He told me that unless I came home and followed the path they'd planned for me, they would stop paying for my college tuition. The words hit like a punch to the gut. College was my one ticket out, the only reason I hadn't completely severed ties with them. My heart pounded as his words sunk in. The threat wasn't just about money. It was about control, about reeling me back into a world I had worked so hard to escape. I stood there in the tiny kitchen, the walls closing in around me as a whirlwind of emotions threatened to swallow me whole. Anger,
Fear.
betrayal. They hadn't noticed when I left, but now, when they felt the loosening grip of control, they decided to step in. The worst part? Deep down, a small part of me had hoped that this call was about something else, that maybe, just maybe, they had noticed after all. But hope, I've learned, is a fragile thing. And sometimes, it's better to let it shatter than to keep holding onto the sharp edges. My parents had always been masters of selective engagement, swooping into my life only when it suited them. Their calls were rare, and when they did happen, they usually carried the weight of a favor disguised as a familial check-in. Take last Thanksgiving, for example. My mother had called me the day before with a half-hearted guilt trip about how I never make time for family anymore. She'd insisted that my absence would ruin the holiday, even though I knew she'd spent most of the day on her phone, scrolling through Instagram. It was like being asked to complete a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces were missing, except in this case, the missing pieces were genuine love and interest. So when my dad's phone call came with a threat to pull my college funding, it almost felt like a parody. The irony? They weren't even paying for it. My tuition had been covered by my grandmother, the only family member who ever cared enough to invest in my future. She had set up a trust fund specifically for my education, bypassing my parents entirely. I'd always suspected she'd done it that way to ensure they couldn't funnel the money into their own endless list of emergencies. The more I thought about it, the more absurd it became. My dad's words replayed in my head like a broken record. If you don't come home, we're cutting you off. Cutting me off from what? Empty promises and conditional love? It felt almost laughable, except the pit in my stomach reminded me this wasn't a joke. This was their way of clawing back control, a desperate move to drag me back into their orbit. Years of being invisible to them suddenly felt sharper, more focused. They hadn't cared when I brought home awards or needed a shoulder to cry on, but now, when I was finally living my life on my terms, they wanted something. Their demands weren't just about proximity. They were about reclaiming the version of me they could manipulate. And as the days passed, their attempts escalated. It started with the phone calls. My dad left voicemail after voicemail, his tone growing increasingly stern. My mom's messages, on the other hand, leaned into melodrama, painting me as the ungrateful child who'd abandoned her family. I ignored them, focusing instead on school and the sanctuary I'd built with Sophie and Rachel. But the more I ignored, the more desperate they became. One evening, I was sprawled out on the couch with Sophie and Rachel, recounting the latest message from my dad, when my phone buzzed. A text from him lit up the screen. It was short, cold, and final. If you don't come home, don't bother coming back. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Sophie snatched the phone out of my hand, reading the message aloud before letting out a string of curses. Rachel, ever the calm voice of reason, placed a hand on my shoulder, her eyes filled with concern. I felt a mix of anger and heartbreak, the words cutting deeper than I'd expected. It wasn't just a threat, it was a severing of ties, a declaration that my independence came at the cost of my family. I vented my frustration to them, pacing the small living room as I tried to make sense of it all. How could they suddenly care so much now, after years of ignoring me? Sophie, ever the fiery one, urged me to stand my ground, reminding me that I didn't owe them anything. Rachel nodded in agreement, pointing out that their love had always been conditional, tied to their own needs rather than mine. They're trying to manipulate you, Rachel said, her voice steady but firm. You don't have to play their game. Their support was a lifeline, anchoring me when the weight of my family's demands threatened to pull me under. But even with their encouragement, the decision wasn't easy. Cutting ties with my parents wasn't just about rejecting their control. It was about letting go of the faint hope that they might one day see me, really see me. And that hope, no matter how small, was hard to extinguish. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. I swung between anger and sadness, defiance and doubt. But as I replayed the events in my head, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about coming home or staying away. This was about choosing myself for the first time in my life, about breaking free from a cycle that had defined me for far too long. And while the path ahead was uncertain, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. The storm of family demands had barely settled when another call came through. This time it was Mark, my eldest brother. Mark rarely called, which should have been my first warning. He always played the intermediary, the family diplomat who smoothed over conflicts with just enough charm to make you forget he was acting on orders. When I picked up, Mark's tone was steady but carried an edge of urgency that immediately put me on guard. The conversation started with small talk, his way of easing me in, but it wasn't long before he cut to the chase. He revealed what my parents had kept hidden, their real motive for dragging me back home. They wanted me to be the guardian for my younger siblings. Not just in a vague, hypothetical way, but in a legally binding, life-altering sense. Apparently, my parents' health was deteriorating. My dad's chronic back pain had turned into something more serious, and my mom's heart issues were worsening. They had decided that I, the responsible one, would step in and take care of the twins, Aaron and Lily, who both had special needs. The revelation hit me like a freight train. Mark's words blurred together as I tried to process the implications. My parents, the same ones who had barely noticed my existence for years, were now planning to hand over their most significant responsibilities to me without so much as a conversation. The audacity left me reeling. Mark tried to spin it as an honor, a testament to my capability and strength. He spoke about family obligations, about how Aaron and Lily needed someone they could trust. But his carefully crafted words only deepened my resentment. The weight of their assumptions was suffocating. They expected me to drop everything, my education, my new life, my hard-won freedom, to clean up a mess I had no part in creating. As Mark's monologue droned on, my mind raced. I thought about the countless times I had been overlooked, ignored, and undervalued. How they had passed over me in favor of my siblings, only to now demand that I shoulder the burdens they couldn't handle. It wasn't just unfair, it was cruel. When I finally found my voice, I pushed back. I asked Mark why this was only coming up now, why my parents hadn't bothered to discuss something so monumental with me directly. His answer was as infuriating as it was predictable. They didn't want to overwhelm you. The irony was almost laughable. They had spent years ignoring me, and now they claimed to care about my emotional capacity? Mark's tone shifted when I didn't immediately agree. He began to pressure me, invoking the same rhetoric my parents had used. "You're still part of the family," he said, as if those words alone could erase the years of neglect. He framed it as a duty, a moral obligation that I couldn't escape. But his attempts to guilt me only hardened my resolve. I refused. Firmly, unequivocally, and without hesitation. I told Mark that I wasn't going to append my life to fix theirs, that their lack of planning wasn't my responsibility to resolve. The words felt both liberating and terrifying as they left my mouth, like stepping off a cliff and hoping the ground beneath you wouldn't give way. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's disappointment was palpable, even through the phone. He tried one last time to sway me, but my mind was made up. I wasn't the family's backup plan, their safety net, or their sacrificial lamb. For the first time, I chose myself over them, and it felt like an act of rebellion as much as self-preservation. When the call ended, the weight of what I'd done began to sink in. I knew this decision would ripple through the family, that it would spark arguments, resentments, and perhaps even estrangement. But as I sat there, staring at the blank wall of my apartment, I also felt an unfamiliar sense of clarity. For years, I had lived in the shadow of my family's dysfunction, bending and twisting myself to fit into a mold they'd created. But this was my line in the sand. I wasn't just refusing their demands, I was reclaiming my life, piece by piece. And for the first time, the future felt like it belonged to me. The fallout from my refusal didn't take long to manifest. Jessica, my eldest sister, was the next to reach out, her message arriving just days after my conversation with Mark. She pleaded for understanding, painting a vivid picture of the family's desperation. Her words were carefully chosen to tug at my heartstrings, recounting how Aaron and Lily needed stability, how our parents' health was failing, and how she wished she could help more but claimed she was already stretched too thin. The implication was clear. I was their only hope. Reading her message, I couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. But alongside the guilt she tried to instill was a growing fire inside me, a defiance born from years of being overlooked and undervalued. I thought about the countless times Jessica had dismissed my struggles, too preoccupied with her role as the eldest sibling and the weight of her own responsibilities to notice what was happening around me. Now, she wanted me to abandon everything I'd built to become the family's escape plan? It was infuriating. I crafted my response with care, refusing to let emotion cloud my judgment. I explained as plainly as I could that I understood the family's challenges, but that their lack of foresight wasn't my responsibility to fix. I reminded her of the years I had spent being invisible, of the times I had needed support and received nothing. I wasn't angry, not entirely at least, but I was resolute. My life was my own, and I wasn't going to sacrifice it for a family that had never truly been there for me. Jessica's reply was swift and filled with frustration. She accused me of being selfish, of turning my back on Aaron and Lily when they needed me most. Her words stung, but they didn't sway me. I'd spent too long prioritizing others' needs over my own, and I wasn't going to fall back into that pattern now. The tension reached a boiling point when an email from my mother landed in my inbox. The subject line, "Family comes first," already set my teeth on edge. Her words were a masterclass in guilt tripping. She spoke about sacrifice, about how she and my dad had given everything for us, and how it was my turn to step up. She painted me as the ungrateful child who had abandoned her family in their time of need. The letter was long, detailed, and emotionally manipulative, a desperate attempt to pull me back into their web. I read it twice, each word sinking like a stone in my chest. The guilt was overwhelming, but beneath it was an undercurrent of anger. My mother had perfected the art of making her needs seem like universal truths, and for years, I'd fallen for it. But this time, I saw through her facade. Her words weren't about love or family. They were about control. That realization was both liberating and heartbreaking. I knew what I had to do, but it didn't make it any easier. I took a deep breath and deleted the email without replying. The action felt symbolic, a way of severing the ties that had held me back for so long. It wasn't just about ignoring her message. It was about choosing myself over the weight of their expectations. Later that evening, I shared everything with Sophie and Rachel. They listened without judgment, offering their unwavering support. Sophie, ever the fiery one, suggested I block their emails altogether. Rachel, more measured, reminded me that setting boundaries didn't make me a bad person. Their words bolstered my resolve, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this. Destroying the letter, metaphorically at least, wasn't just an act of defiance against Jessica's and my parents' expectations. It was a declaration of independence, a way of reclaiming my life from the shadows of my family's dysfunction. For the first time, I felt like I was truly standing on my own, unburdened by their expectations. And while the road ahead was uncertain, I knew I was ready to face it, on my terms. It happened without warning. My mother appeared at my apartment one rainy afternoon, the knock on the door startling me out of a rare moment of peace. I opened it to find her standing there, soaked from the rain, but with an air of determination that instantly put me on edge. Her unexpected visit was an ambush, and I knew it before she even spoke. She wasted no time, launching into a speech about family, duty, and my father's worsening health. Her words were heavy with implication, each sentence a veiled accusation that I was abandoning the people who needed me most. She painted a picture of my father, frail, struggling, on the verge of breaking under the weight of caring for Aaron and Lily. It was a masterful attempt at emotional blackmail, and for a moment, I felt the familiar sting of guilt. But then I saw it for what it was. This wasn't about concern for my father or the twins. It was about control. My mother wasn't here to have a conversation. She was here to manipulate me into submission. Her desperation was palpable, but it didn't soften me. If anything, it steeled my resolve. I let her words wash over me, each one sharpening the edge of my anger. She spoke of sacrifices, of how she and my father had given so much for our family. The irony was unbearable. Where were these sacrifices when I needed them? Where was this devotion when I was growing up, invisible in the chaos of my siblings' crises? Her narrative conveniently excluded the years of neglect, the times they had turned a blind eye to my struggles. When she finally paused, looking at me with an expression that was equal parts expectation and exhaustion, I found my voice. I told her the truth about how her and Dad's neglect had shaped me, about the resentment that had grown over years of being the forgotten child. I reminded her that I had built my life from the ground up without their support and that I wasn't willing to give it all up now to clean up their mess. She looked stunned, as if she hadn't expected me to push back so forcefully. For a moment, I saw a flicker of something, regret, maybe, or a realization. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by indignation. She accused me of being selfish, of failing as a daughter and a sister. Her words were sharp, but they didn't cut as deeply as they once might have. I had heard it all before, and I was done letting it define me. The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with silence. She left without another word, her expression a mixture of disappointment and frustration. As the door closed behind her, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The weight I had carried for so long seemed to lift, leaving me lighter, freer. In the hours that followed, I reflected on what had just happened. For years, I had been trapped in the cycle of seeking their approval, of trying to fit into the mold they had created for me. Breaking free felt like stepping into the sunlight after years in the shadows. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. I knew the decision to cut ties with my parents would ripple through the family, that it would spark anger and possibly even estrangement. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the consequences. I was choosing myself, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I wasn't their escape plan, their safety net, or their solution. I was my own person, and it was time I started living like it. That night, as I sat with Sophie and Rachel, I told them everything. Their support was unwavering, their belief in me a balm for the wounds left by the confrontation. Sophie, true to form, celebrated my defiance, while Rachel offered her quiet reassurance. Between the two of them, I felt a sense of belonging I had never known with my own family. The breaking point wasn't just about saying no to my mother. It was about reclaiming my life, my agency, my future. And as I sat there, surrounded by the people who truly cared for me, I realized that I wasn't walking away from a family. I was walking toward one. In the aftermath of my mother's visit, I expected an onslaught of phone calls, emails, and messages from the rest of the family. But what followed was an eerie silence. It was as if my refusal had rendered me invisible once again, but this time, the isolation felt like a gift rather than a punishment. For the first time in years, I had the space to breathe, to think, and to start piecing together what I wanted my life to look like. The quiet didn't last long. A week later, I received an unexpected email from Mark. Unlike his earlier attempts to manipulate or guilt me, this one was surprisingly neutral. He explained that he had taken over as the point of contact for Aaron and Lily's care. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pressure they'd tried to put on me, but there was a sense of finality in his words. He assured me that the situation was under control and that I didn't need to worry about it anymore. I read the message twice, searching for hidden barbs or veiled accusations, but there were none. It was a clean break, and I allowed myself a moment to savor it. Mark's decision to step up was long overdue, and while it didn't erase the years of neglect or the pain of their demands, it was a step in the right direction. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change. With the family's hold over me finally severed, I threw myself into my studies and part-time job with a newfound sense of purpose. Sophie and Rachel remained my constant anchors, their unwavering support reminding me that family could be chosen, not just inherited. We celebrated small victories together, passing exams, landing promotions, or simply making it through a tough week. These moments, though ordinary, felt extraordinary in their simplicity. One day, I received a letter from my grandmother. It was handwritten, her elegant script filling the pages with warmth and understanding. She had heard about the fallout from my mother, though she didn't take sides. Instead, she offered her love and reminded me that my happiness was what mattered most. Her words were a balm to my soul, a reminder that not all family ties were burdens to bear. Enclosed with the letter was a small envelope containing a check, a gesture of support, not obligation. It was enough to cover the remaining costs of my tuition, ensuring I could finish school without financial strain. As the weeks turned into months, the wounds left by my family began to heal. The anger and resentment that had once consumed me were replaced by a quiet determination to build a life on my terms. I started therapy, diving into the tangled web of emotions and experiences that had shaped me. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. With each session, I felt lighter, more in control of my narrative. The twins, Aaron and Lily, remained a constant thought in the back of my mind. I worried about them, about whether Mark was truly equipped to handle their needs. But I also knew that stepping in would only perpetuate the cycle I had worked so hard to escape. Instead, I sent small care packages, books, toys, and little notes as a way of maintaining a connection without sacrificing my boundaries. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough for now. Looking back, I realized that breaking away from my family wasn't just about self-preservation. It was about redefining what family meant to me. Sophie and Rachel weren't just my roommates. They were my sisters in every way that mattered. My grandmother wasn't just a relative. She was my guiding light, the one who had always seen me for who I was. One evening, as the three of us sat on the balcony of our apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known before. The chaos of my upbringing no longer dictated my present. The weight of my family's expectations no longer shaped my choices. For the first time, my life felt like it truly belonged to me. It wasn't a perfect ending. My family's dysfunction hadn't magically resolved, and there were still moments of doubt and sadness. But it was my ending, and that was enough. I had walked away from the shadows of my past and stepped into the light of my own making. And as I sat there, surrounded by the family I had chosen, I knew I was finally free.